August 7, 1942. The island of Guadalcanal smoldered under the Pacific sun. U.S. Marines crouched low in foxholes as Japanese artillery pounded their positions. Explosions tore through the humid air, shaking the ground, shredding palm trees, and filling the jungle with choking smoke. Amid the chaos, one sound pierced through the static of battlefield radios, a rapid stream of syllables, unfamiliar and melodic, flowing in a cadence unlike English. To the Marines, it was clear as day. To the Japanese, it was incomprehensible. This was the first combat baptism of the Navajo Code Talkers. The U.S. military had entered the Pacific War with a serious problem. Their communications were vulnerable. Traditional codes, whether numeric or cipher-based, had been repeatedly compromised. Japanese cryptographers, trained in the world's finest intelligence schools, had cracked several American systems. Each breach cost lives. Orders delayed by hours, or worse, intercepted by the enemy, meant entire units could be ambushed or annihilated. Secure, rapid communication was not just a convenience, it was survival. On Guadalcanal, survival hung by a thread. The Marines fought not only the Japanese Imperial Army, but also starvation, tropical disease, and exhaustion. The island's dense jungles turned every movement into a deadly gamble. In this environment, speed and secrecy of communication could mean the difference between holding the line or being overrun. The solution had come from an unlikely source, the Navajo Nation. A year earlier, Major Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran and one of the few non-Navajos fluent in the language, had pitched the idea to the Marine Corps. Navajo, he explained, was spoken by fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the world. It had no written form, relied on tonal inflections, and contained sounds that baffled outsiders. To craft a code within such a language would be to create a fortress of words, impervious to enemy decryption. Now, on the beaches and ridgelines of Guadalcanal, that theory was put to the test. Two Marines with radios crouched shoulder to shoulder. One spoke into the handset, a burst of Navajo words strung together in fluid rhythm. The second Marine, fluent in both Navajo and English, transcribed instantly. Coordinates for artillery fire, a request for reinforcements, a warning of Japanese flanking maneuvers. Within minutes, U.S. artillery batteries shifted and roared to life, raining shells exactly where they were needed. The counterattack stalled. An officer later recalled that the messages moved so quickly it seemed almost supernatural. "We were used to delays," he remembered. With them, it was like the battle had a nervous system, instant reflexes. For the Japanese, who monitored every Allied transmission with obsessive diligence, it was maddening. The words sounded human, but no codebook, no cipher wheel, and no expert could crack the pattern. It wasn't a pattern at all. It was a living language, born in the mesas and deserts of the American Southwest, now woven into the fabric of war. The first 29 Navajo recruits had crafted a codebook earlier that year at Camp Pendleton. They had invented hundreds of terms, translating the machinery of modern warfare into the imagery of Navajo life. Turtle for tank, iron fish for submarine, buzzard for bomber. What seemed like ordinary words in conversation became a precise lexicon when transmitted over radio. The brilliance of the system lay in its speed and its secrecy. A message that might take hours to encrypt and decode by machine could be sent and understood in less than a minute by two Navajo Marines. On Guadalcanal, that speed was priceless. Japanese assaults came in waves, night raids by fanatical infantry, sudden banzai charges through the jungle, and relentless shelling from the sea. The Navajo Code Talkers, often operating under fire, relayed positions, coordinated movements, and kept scattered units connected. Their calm voices, steady in the midst of chaos, became the unseen backbone of Marine operations. One Marine later recalled huddling in a trench as mortars exploded around them. A code talker beside him spoke rapidly into the radio, his tone unwavering. It was like he was pulling order out of the madness, the Marines said. We trusted those voices more than anything. By the campaign's end, Guadalcanal was secured at staggering cost. The U.S. lost nearly 7,000 men, Japan, more than 19,000. Yet within that blood-soaked struggle, a secret weapon had proven itself. The Navajo Code was never broken. Not on Guadalcanal, not in the Solomons, not anywhere in the Pacific. The success sent ripples through the Marine Corps. What began as an experiment with 29 Navajo men would soon expand into a program of hundreds. Their voices, carrying across battlefields, had given the Marines not just a code, but an edge, a way to outpace and outmaneuver an enemy renowned for cunning and discipline. The world had just witnessed the birth of a new kind of weapon, not forged in steel or fire, but carried on the breath of warriors who spoke the language of their ancestors. And Guadalcanal was only the beginning. The success on Guadalcanal had not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of an idea born long before the first shots were fired in the Pacific. To understand how an ancient tongue from the deserts of the American Southwest became America's most secret weapon, one must turn back to the language itself, Navajo. For centuries, it had been passed orally from generation to generation, never fixed in writing, never standardized by textbooks or dictionaries. Its sounds were intricate, shaped by tonal shifts and nasal inflections foreign to English speakers. A single change in pitch could alter meaning entirely. To outsiders, it was baffling. To the Navajo, it was a living thread that tied them to ancestors, ceremonies, and the land. Linguists who studied it in the early 20th century often remarked that it was among the most complex languages in North America, nearly impossible for adults to learn fluently without years of immersion. In 1942, as America reeled from Pearl Harbor and scrambled to secure every advantage against Japan, one man recognized this potential. His name was Philip Johnston, a civil engineer, a World War I veteran, and the son of missionaries who had lived on the Navajo Nation. Johnston had grown up among Navajo children, speaking their language with ease. When war came, he knew the U.S. military was desperate for a code that the Japanese could neither break nor even recognize. Johnston saw the answer in the words he had carried since childhood. At first, the idea seemed far-fetched. The Marine Corps had never recruited Native Americans for specialized cryptographic work. When Johnston presented his proposal, officers were skeptical. Could a language really serve as a code? Could men who had grown up herding sheep in remote reservations translate the intricate machinery of war into words fast enough to be useful? To prove it, Johnston arranged a test at Camp Pendleton in February 1942. 4 Navajo speakers were paired with English-speaking Marines. The officers dictated a series of complex military messages, troop movements, artillery coordinates, logistics requests. Normally, encoding and decoding such orders could take hours with cipher machines and codebooks. But the Navajo men listened, translated into their language, and relayed the message across the room. Within moments, their partners decoded it back into flawless English. The results stunned the Marine Corps. A test message that had taken cryptographers 2.5 hours to encrypt by standard methods was translated, sent, and received in under 3 minutes using Navajo. Accuracy was perfect. Speed was unmatched. One officer later recalled his astonishment. It was as though we had discovered a shortcut through the entire labyrinth of war communications. The skepticism melted away. The Marines had seen the future, and it spoke Navajo. The first group of 29 Navajo recruits arrived at Camp Pendleton soon after. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, drawn from the mesas, canyons, and hogans of the reservation. Many had never traveled far from their communities, yet they now found themselves thrust into the most secret project of the Marine Corps. Their mission was not simply to speak their language, but to forge it into a code. They began by creating a system that mapped Navajo words to military terms. A tank became Chaitagahi, meaning turtle. A battleship was Lotso, or whale. A bomber was Jaysho, the buzzard. They invented a phonetic alphabet as well, using Navajo words to represent English letters. Woolachi for ant as A, shush for bear as B, and so on. By combining these two systems, they could describe any piece of equipment, any location, any command. What emerged was not just a code, but a living language layered with metaphor. It was simple for Navajo speakers to remember, yet utterly indecipherable to anyone else. Even if an enemy captured a code talker, without fluency in Navajo and the specialized vocabulary, the words would remain nonsense. Training was rigorous. The men drilled for hours, memorizing hundreds of terms, practicing rapid translation, and adapting their language to the clipped urgency of battlefield radio. They carried no code books, nothing written that could be captured. Every word, every phrase, was committed to memory. At first, some officers doubted whether native recruits could adapt to the discipline of military life. But the young Navajo Marines quickly shattered those prejudices. They marched, drilled, and trained as hard as any others, while mastering a task that no other soldiers in the world could perform. Their performance silenced skeptics and earned respect across the Corps. By the summer of 1942, the first Navajo Code Talkers were ready for deployment. Their language, once confined to the canyons of Arizona and New Mexico, was about to become the shield and sword of American forces across the Pacific. What had begun as an experiment was now indispensable. The ancient rhythms of Navajo speech, once sung in ceremonies and told in stories beneath desert skies, would soon echo through radios in jungles, on beaches, and aboard ships. It was a fusion of old and new, of tradition and technology, an ancient language meeting modern war. And as the war spread across the Pacific, the Navajo voices would grow louder, carrying secrets that no enemy could ever hope to understand. The first 29 Navajo Code Talkers were not soldiers when the war began. They were shepherds tending flocks on the mesas of Arizona, farmers coaxing corn from dry earth, and students learning in modest reservation schools. Most had never left the Southwest, and many spoke little English beyond what was needed for daily life. Yet in 1942, when the Marine Corps called, they answered, stepping from the quiet rhythms of reservation life into the machinery of global war. At Camp Pendleton in California, the young recruits found themselves thrust into a new world of barking sergeants, endless drills, and the harsh discipline of Marine Corps training. For men raised in communities that valued cooperation and respect, the shouted orders of drill instructors were jarring. Some had never eaten in a mess hall, slept in a barracks, or worn boots before. One veteran later recalled that the march formations and shouted commands seemed like learning another language altogether. Yet they adapted quickly, drawing on resilience forged by years of survival in harsh desert lands. The cultural clash was real. On the reservation, kinship ties and clan responsibilities shaped every decision. In the Marines, hierarchy was absolute, and individuality was suppressed for the sake of discipline. Still, the Navajo recruits carried with them a deep sense of identity. They sang traditional songs quietly at night, prayed before battles, and found strength in the knowledge that their language, long dismissed by outsiders, was now at the heart of America's war effort. Training was grueling. The men endured forced marches with full packs, live-fire exercises, and the punishing physical regimen that transformed civilians into Marines. But while their bodies hardened, their minds focused on an even greater task, building a code. In a small classroom at Camp Pendleton, the first 29 Navajo Marines sat down to do what no one else could. They began crafting a dictionary of military terms in Navajo, a living tool that would grow as the war expanded. A tank became Chaitagahi, the turtle. A submarine was Beshlo, meaning iron fish. A bomber aircraft was Jaysho, the buzzard. Their system was both ingenious and flexible. For letters of the alphabet, they chose Navajo words beginning with the same sound. A became Wolachi, or ant. B was shush, bear. C was mosi, cat. With this phonetic code, they could spell out any English word if no direct translation existed. Over time, the dictionary expanded to more than 600 terms. Each entry had to be memorized. Nothing was ever written down. The security of the system depended entirely on the minds of the men who carried it. In this way, the Code Talkers became living codebooks, walking, breathing encryption devices who could deliver messages faster than any machine. The training forged them into elite communicators. They practiced under pressure, simulating the chaos of combat. Messages had to be clear, concise, and rapid. Lives would depend on it. One Marine officer, watching the recruits work, marveled that they could send and decode a complex message in less than 20 seconds, compared to the half-hour required by cipher machines. For the Navajo men, the responsibility weighed heavily. They understood that they were more than just soldiers. They were guardians of a language that had survived centuries of suppression. Many of them had been punished as children for speaking Navajo in government schools. Now, that very language had become a weapon the enemy could not crack. Oral histories capture their pride and their fear. One code talker remembered thinking, "If I make a mistake, men will die. I cannot fail." Another recalled the astonishment of fellow Marines who could not believe the speed and accuracy of the Navajo transmissions. Respect grew quickly. What had begun as a skeptical experiment became an indispensable part of the Marine Corps' communication strategy. By the summer of 1942, the first 29 code talkers were ready. They had endured boot camp, forged a new lexicon, and blended ancient traditions with modern warfare. They were warriors of two worlds, rooted in Navajo culture, yet carrying radios and rifles for the United States Marine Corps. Soon, their voices would echo across the Pacific, weaving together an unbreakable thread of communication. In the jungles, on the beaches, and in the skies, their words would carry orders that decided battles. The transformation was complete. The shepherds had become soldiers, the storytellers had become code makers, and their language had become America's most secret weapon. And as the Marines prepared to launch campaigns across the Pacific, the Navajo Code Talkers would soon face the ultimate test: combat. The crucible of combat came quickly for the Navajo Code Talkers. What had begun as an experiment in 1942 was now being tested in the unforgiving battlefields of the Pacific. From the sweltering jungles of Guadalcanal to the black volcanic sands of Saipan, their voices carried across the din of war, guiding Marine divisions with precision and speed that no machine could match. On Guadalcanal, the first major American offensive in the Pacific, Marines dug into muddy foxholes under relentless Japanese bombardment. Communications were often the difference between holding a line and being overrun. Traditional encryption systems, bulky, slow, and prone to error, had proven deadly liabilities. A single urgent message could take hours to encode, transmit, and decode. But when the code talkers spoke into their radios, orders that once crawled through the wires were delivered in seconds. It was like hearing lightning strike, one Marine later recalled, marveling at the speed with which reinforcements were summoned to critical points. The system's brilliance lay in its simplicity for the Navajo and its impenetrability to outsiders. Japanese intelligence, renowned for breaking Allied codes in the early war years, found themselves utterly confounded. No amount of intercepted traffic could reveal the meaning behind the strange, melodic syllables. The language was not only unrecorded but layered with cultural nuance, making it impossible for even expert linguists to decipher. By late 1943, the code talkers had proven indispensable. At Bougainville, they coordinated the movements of infantry and artillery under withering fire. When Japanese forces launched a counterattack, rapid Navajo transmissions directed Marine defenses with near-instant precision, closing gaps before the enemy could exploit them. Officers reported that the code had saved countless lives by eliminating the delays of conventional ciphers. The true test came at Tarawa in November 1943. The tiny atoll, heavily fortified and ringed with coral reefs, became one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. Radios crackled as waves of Marines struggled ashore under withering machine gun fire. Amid smoke and chaos, code talkers sent out critical orders, coordinates for naval gunfire, requests for medical evacuations, and updates on enemy positions. What might have been garbled or delayed through standard channels was relayed with flawless speed. One Marine remembered his astonishment. "Those Navajos were faster than the artillery itself. Before I could reload, the order was already sent." As the war pushed northward, the code talkers marched with it. On Saipan in June 1944, the stakes could not have been higher. The island's capture would bring Japan within reach of American bombers. Fighting raged in jungles, villages, and ridgelines where every hill became a fortress. In this chaos, the code talkers' radios became lifelines. Navajo voices called in naval bombardments that shattered Japanese strongpoints and coordinated armored assaults that broke through entrenched defenses. Their transmissions, carried over the roar of flamethrowers and the thunder of artillery, became the backbone of Marine communication. Eyewitness accounts from Saipan tell of officers who simply stood in disbelief at the efficiency of the system. Messages once requiring hours were transmitted and decoded in under a minute. Soldiers on the ground, unaware of the mechanics, only knew that reinforcements arrived faster, fire support was more accurate, and lives were being spared. For them, the Navajo language had become a shield in the midst of slaughter. The code talkers themselves carried both pride and burden. They were Marines, enduring the same hunger, exhaustion, and fear as their comrades. But their task was unique. One slip of the tongue, one mistranslated word, could cost an entire unit. Many later spoke of the weight of responsibility, the knowledge that their voices were as lethal as rifles. By the end of 1944, their reputation had spread through the Marine Corps. Commanders requested code talkers by name, demanding their presence in every major operation. German cryptographers, considered the best in the world, had broken dozens of Allied systems. Japanese intelligence had cracked British naval codes and American diplomatic ciphers. But not once did they penetrate the Navajo Code. It was a living weapon, carried in the minds of men whose ancestors had once been forbidden to speak their language, and now wielded it as the deadliest secret of the Pacific War. The baptism by fire had proven decisive. Across islands scarred by shellfire and stained by sacrifice, the code talkers had shown that their ancient words could command fleets, move armies, and shape battles. Their voices had become as essential as bullets, their courage as enduring as the Marines they served beside. And as the war surged toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the demand for the Navajo Code Talkers would only grow, for the battles ahead would test them as never before. In February 1945, the eyes of the world turned toward a speck of volcanic rock in the Pacific, Iwo Jima. Barely 8 square miles in size, it was little more than a barren island scarred by sulfur vents and jagged cliffs. But its location, halfway between the Mariana Islands and Japan, made it indispensable. From its airfields, Japanese fighters could intercept American bombers bound for Tokyo. To take Iwo Jima was to open the final road to Japan. To hold it was to deny the enemy a last bastion of defense. On February 19th, the assault began. At dawn, the sea boiled with fire as naval guns unleashed one of the heaviest bombardments of the war. Thousands of Marines clambered into landing craft, their rifles clenched against their chests, their faces grim. They believed the bombardment had silenced the defenders. But as the first waves hit the black volcanic beaches, Japanese guns erupted from hidden bunkers and tunnels. Machine guns tore into men struggling through the ash-like sand. Artillery shells shattered steel and bone, and the waters off Iwo Jima turned red. In this crucible, the Navajo Code Talkers found their ultimate test. Radios crackled with urgency. Over the roar of explosions, calm Navajo voices carried messages that would decide life and death. Within the first 48 hours, they transmitted coordinates for artillery strikes, called in reinforcements, and guided naval bombardments. Each message precise, each word carrying immense weight. For 36 days, the battle raged with unrelenting fury. Japanese defenders, numbering about 21,000 under General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, fought from a labyrinth of tunnels stretching nearly 11 miles beneath the island. These underground fortresses allowed them to emerge suddenly, strike, and vanish again. Marines advanced yard by yard, paying for every foot of ground with blood. Amid the chaos, the Code Talkers never faltered. Over the course of the campaign, they sent more than 800 messages, not a single one garbled, delayed, or misinterpreted. One Marine officer later remarked with awe, "Without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." His words were not exaggeration. Conventional codes would have slowed communication to a crawl. On Iwo Jima, minutes meant the difference between survival and annihilation. The Code Talkers could relay complex orders in under 30 seconds, faster than any cipher machine, immune to interception and utterly reliable. The battle's most iconic moment came on February 23rd, when Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph captured by Joe Rosenthal became a symbol of victory and sacrifice. But behind that moment of triumph lay hours of coordinated struggle, guided by voices few outside the Corps would ever know. The Code Talkers transmitted the positions of advancing units, ensured artillery covered the flanks, and directed supporting fire that allowed the ascent of the mountain. Eyewitness accounts describe the surreal juxtaposition of carnage and calm. Amid the thunder of mortars and the cries of the wounded, the Navajo operators spoke in steady, melodic tones, unshaken by the fury around them. One Marine later recalled, "In the middle of hell, those voices sounded like steel. They never broke, never wavered." By the time the island was declared secure on March 26th, the cost was staggering. Nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, almost all were dead, only a few hundred taken prisoner. The black sands of Iwo Jima bore silent witness to the savagery of modern war. Yet within this storm of destruction, the Code Talkers' contribution stood apart. They had given the Marines a weapon of communication the enemy could never silence. The legacy of Iwo Jima cemented their reputation. Commanders across the Pacific recognized the indispensability of the Navajo language. In an era when machines and codes could be broken, the human voices of these men proved unbreakable. Their work on Iwo Jima was more than a tactical advantage. It was a lifeline, a shield, and in many ways, the unseen hand that guided victory. As the Marines prepared for the next and even bloodier campaign at Okinawa, they carried with them not just rifles and ammunition, but the certainty that the Navajo voices on the radio would once again stand between chaos and control. The guns of World War II fell silent in August 1945, but for the Navajo Code Talkers, silence of another kind endured. Their war was not over. When they returned home from the Pacific, many still teenagers, others hardened by years of combat, they carried with them a secret they could not share. Their mission, the code that had saved countless American lives and helped win decisive battles, remained classified by the United States government. For more than 2 decades, the story of the Code Talkers was locked away, hidden from the very people whose freedom they had helped secure. Life on the reservation greeted them not with parades, but with hardship. Many returned to poverty, unemployment, and the systemic inequalities that had long plagued Native American communities. The war had given them a purpose, a chance to serve as warriors for their nation, but peace brought little recognition. Families often asked what role they had played, what tasks they had carried out in distant islands like Saipan, Tarawa, or Iwo Jima. Yet the Code Talkers could only remain quiet, bound by their oath of secrecy. One veteran later reflected that he could not even tell his wife or children the truth of what he had done. His silence was not born of shame, but of duty. In this way, the very secrecy that had made the Navajo Code so powerful in war now became a burden in peace. The cultural clash deepened their struggles. These men had lived through the brutality of modern warfare, carrying radios through jungles under fire, relaying life-or-death orders in a language their ancestors had spoken for centuries. Yet when they returned, many were thrust back into rural life, expected to resume farming or shepherding. Others tried to adapt to urban America, only to confront discrimination and a lack of opportunity. Some bore scars of battle, both visible and hidden, wounds that went unrecognized by a society eager to move on. For years, their contribution remained invisible even in military history. Textbooks recounted the valor of Marines on Iwo Jima or the triumph of victory in the Pacific, but nowhere was there mention of the quiet voices on the radios, speaking in Navajo, holding the fragile line of communication together. It was not until 1968, 23 years after the end of the war, that the veil of secrecy was finally lifted. By then, many of the original Code Talkers had grown old, their hair gray, their voices slower. Yet at last, their story could be told. The revelation stunned the public that a native language once suppressed in government boarding schools had, in fact, been the key to victory in some of the fiercest battles of the Pacific. Recognition came, but slowly. Veterans associations began to honor the Code Talkers at reunions. Documentaries and newspaper features highlighted their achievements. Their presence at parades drew applause. But for many, the long years of silence had left wounds. They had lived through decades of anonymity, denied the pride of openly sharing their service with their children and grandchildren. In 2001, the United States government finally took a step worthy of their legacy. President George W. Bush presented the original 29 Code Talkers with congressional gold medals, the nation's highest civilian honor. Hundreds of others received silver medals. At last, in the twilight of their lives, the Code Talkers stood in the public eye, not as forgotten warriors, but as heroes of the highest order. During the ceremony, the president acknowledged what history had long overlooked. By using their native language, they defeated the enemy. They carried our nation's security on their shoulders. For the Code Talkers, the recognition was bittersweet. Many of their comrades had already passed, their names unrecorded, their deeds unrecognized. Yet the moment marked a long-overdue turning point. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not only one of ingenuity and wartime heroism, but also of resilience in the face of silence. They endured poverty, discrimination, and decades of invisibility, yet they carried their burden with quiet dignity. Their service had always been about something larger than themselves, protecting their fellow Marines, securing victory, and honoring the warrior spirit of their people. And so, their legacy lives on, not only in medals or ceremonies, but in the enduring truth that a language born of the desert winds and sacred canyons once shaped the course of global history. The war ended, but the echoes of the Code Talkers' voices never faded. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, and the shattered islands of the Pacific, their words had carried commands, coordinates, and hope. Not a single Japanese cryptographer ever broke the Navajo Code. It stands in history as the only oral code in modern warfare never deciphered by the enemy. In the age of machines, mathematics, and cryptanalysis, victory had been secured through the endurance of a language rooted in tradition, ceremony, and identity. The significance of their achievement cannot be measured in battle reports alone. The Navajo language, once suppressed in schools, once punished by authorities, had proven indispensable to global victory. What had been dismissed as primitive became, in the crucible of war, unbreakable. For the Navajo people, this transformation was more than tactical, it was cultural vindication. One Marine officer later reflected that the Code Talkers gave us an edge we could not have bought with any weapon. Indeed, their transmissions often meant the difference between life and annihilation. When artillery fell exactly where it was needed, when reinforcements arrived at the right moment, when chaos gave way to order on the battlefield, it was the calm cadence of Navajo voices guiding the way. Today, the legacy of the Code Talkers endures in stone, ceremony, and story. Monuments rise in Arizona and New Mexico, honoring the young men who once carried radios across foreign beaches. Museums and schools dedicate exhibits to their service, ensuring new generations learn that language itself can be a shield and a sword. Documentaries, novels, and films continue to bring their story to audiences worldwide, filling the silence that once surrounded their mission. Their recognition came late, decades after the war, but it came nonetheless. The medals placed around their necks were more than decorations. They were symbols of gratitude for lives saved and battles won. Yet perhaps the greatest honor lies not in awards, but in remembrance. Each time their story is told, each time their voices are replayed in recordings, the Code Talkers live on. Theirs was a bridge between two worlds. They had grown up herding sheep beneath desert skies, speaking a language passed down through chants and stories. In war, that same language carried artillery strikes across the Pacific, threaded into the fabric of modern combat. Tradition and modernity did not clash, they combined, and in doing so, helped secure victory. The story comes full circle when one returns to that first battlefield scene. The Marines in foxholes, the air thick with smoke, the radios alive with urgent messages. Over the chaos, the Navajo Code flowed, unshaken, unbroken. Decades later, the memory of those voices remains more enduring than the weapons they directed. The legacy of the Navajo Code Talkers is not merely military, it is human. It reminds us that the most powerful weapons of war are not always forged of steel or fire. Sometimes, they are spoken from the heart, carried in the breath of a people who refuse to be silenced. And so, the final word belongs not to the cannons or the flags, but to the language itself. Ancient, resilient, unbreakable. Echoing through history is the code that won a war and gave voice to a nation.